Senator, are you ready to take the oath?
I am, sir.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
I don't believe that in the previous administration there was enough investments in the public health system. And I'm not being critical, I'm just stating a fact.
If 9/11 set the gears in motion for Congress to act, it was another attack that made health security a priority in Washington.
Senate office buildings on Capitol Hill and postal facilities along the East Coast would all become contaminated with anthrax spores.
Bioterrorism is a real threat to our country.
The Centers for Disease Control today issued a health warning for Americans following a worldwide outbreak of a mysterious form of pneumonia, causing deaths and sending scores to the hospital.
In 2002, a case of atypical pneumonia was reported in China. Later known as SARS and caused by a new coronavirus, it spread to 29 countries and killed close to 800 people.
What little we know about this coronavirus so far is that it appears to be spread most often from droplets, say sneezing and coughing.
The president has made clear that we have a responsibility to prepare our nation for future threats.
At some point, we are likely to face another pandemic.
What we do know is that pandemics happen, and that we will have a pandemic at some point in the future if history is our guide. It may not be the H5N1 virus, but we will have one. This H5N1 virus is sweeping across the world.
From the beginning, we recognized that we needed to take a comprehensive view of the threat and do everything possible to protect against the emergence and spread of a pandemic virus.
As President Barack Obama took office, pandemic preparation was once again set aside.
I was distressed when Obama moved into the White House that they abolished the Office of Health and Security that they inherited from the Bush administration.
We will need to stabilize, repair, and reform our banking system and get credit flowing again to families and businesses. We will need to end the culture where we ignore problems until they become full-blown crises.
It seemed like health was the kind of issue that a progressive Democrat would embrace pretty readily, and they just abolished it.
But in 2009, the new president was soon confronted with his first health crisis.
Death toll rises in Mexico's capital city. The worried line up for testing, their faces covered with masks.
This particular H1N1 strain has not circulated previously in humans. The scientific criteria for an influenza pandemic have been met. Countries where outbreaks appear to have peaked should prepare for a second wave of infection.
H1N1 was a deadly swine flu that spread rapidly to more than 200 countries, and scientists estimate it killed nearly 300,000 people worldwide.
Within a year, the H1N1 influenza began to move around the world.
And yet the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic and we're seeing a lot of people getting infected, and we're seeing that some of them are getting seriously ill, particularly people in these high-risk categories like pregnant women and children and people with underlying conditions, so that the risk of not being protected against influenza balanced against the risk of the vaccine is no doubt that the balance of risk-benefit strongly favors the benefit of vaccine because of the risk of influenza versus the relatively small risk of the vaccine.
Because the vaccine now has FDA approval, it meets government quality standards and is made properly. Last week, it was announced that people getting the swine flu vaccine will need only one dose.
The administration scrambled to respond to it. I think overall did a fairly good job, but obviously, lives were lost. More than 10,000 people died.
But my fear, frankly, is when this is over, we'll decide we don't need to worry about a pandemic for the next 30 years. Nothing could be more dangerous.
One of the principal cheerleaders of gain-of-function research from the get-go was the now famous, or infamous if you prefer, Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was arguing that it made sense to engineer in the lab highly infectious and highly deadly viruses
Whenever you do research that involves infectious diseases, there's the possibility of what we call dual use, namely significant benefits from the research, as well as the possibility of some risks. Because in nature, the virus is already doing what we're trying to figure out it's doing now with the experiments. So if we don't do any experiments, the virus is just not going to go away. It's here, it's a clear danger, it's a present danger, and that's the reason why we're doing research on it.
And so in order to devise a defense, he argued, we need to create monster viruses in the lab. We need to anticipate the next zoonosis, create deadly and infectious viruses in the lab using gain-of-function technology, and then develop therapeutic drugs to cure them and vaccines to immunize people against them. That was his argument, and he made it everywhere in the early years of this century, including in the pages of an editorial in the Washington Post.
It's a real-life tale that reads like science fiction. A Dutch scientist using U.S. government funding creates a deadly synthetic virus, a super lethal bird flu. It makes it potentially the most dangerous flu virus that's ever been created in the world. Dr. Ron Fouché says he created the new man-made virus because, in his words, I wanted to see what was possible. He successfully transferred it to a ferret, a stand-in for humans. Now the government that paid for it wants him to keep the virus a secret, afraid it could become a blueprint for terrorists to launch a global pandemic. I wish that the work hadn't been done to begin with, but now that we're here, it makes the most sense. A panel advising the U.S. government is asking two major journals, Science and Nature, to black out details of Fouché's paper. Not all scientists agree. Scientists want to know how the virus mutates and jumps from one species to another so they can stop it when it does. Some say that doesn't have to mean releasing a recipe for disaster.
This marks the first time the government has ever asked scientists not to publish the details of a biomedical experiment. And they're doing it because while bird flu rarely affects people, when it does, it kills at an alarming rate.
In 2009 and 2010, the H1N1 virus left an estimated 12,000 people dead. As scientists debate Fouché's findings, an outbreak of aviary flu in Hong Kong has authorities killing 17,000 chickens.
More information is emerging on the Alberta resident who died last week of bird flu. Officials stress it is an isolated case and assure the public the risk of spreading it is extremely low. But influenza viruses are constantly evolving, and that's why this death is being taken very seriously.
The avian flu is not easily transmitted between humans. Over the last decade, there have been fewer than 650 cases worldwide.
This is an isolated case, first of its kind in North America, and given the history, I doubt whether we'll see this again.
But a similar message was given to people when SARS first came to North America in 2002, and it left dozens dead.
And likely will come a time in which we have an airborne disease that is deadly.
In 2014, there were fears that moment had arrived with the emergence of Ebola. A fast-acting and often fatal virus, Ebola spread quickly from a small village in Guinea to neighboring Sierra Leone and then to Liberia.
We've been told now by the hospital that Thomas Eric Duncan has passed away.
Thomas Eric Duncan died in Dallas from Ebola.
This concern about Ebola has served as a kind of wake-up call to hospitals. Health departments across this country determined not to repeat any of the mistakes we saw made in Dallas.
In 2014, in the United States, there was a moratorium placed on gain-of-function research. American labs were informed that the NIH specifically would no longer be funding gain-of-function research. So what happened when American researchers were forbidden from doing gain-of-function research is that a workaround was found so that money could be sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to Dr. Fauci's friend, Dr. Shizhong Li, so she could continue to do gain-of-function research.
Passing this emergency funding to fight Ebola and to set up some of the public health infrastructure so that if and when a new strain of flu like the Spanish flu crops up 5 years from now or a decade from now, we've made the investment.
I thought I would bring that perspective to the topic today. There will be a surprise outbreak.
The U.S. moratorium, however limited, was lifted in 2017.